So today I want to go over what's probably going to be the final version of my Poison Landslide Druid build. And this build has become so incredibly strong compared to what I thought it was going to be. And we have even gotten some pretty significant power increases even from the last version of this build. And while this final version of the build only has a handful of changes, those handful of changes have massively increased our overall power. So our first version of this build, we started with only using one unique, which is the Mjolnir ring, which is while Cataclysm is active, you gain massively increased damage. And with the final version of this build, you'll be able to have this up 100% of the time. Then in the second version, we added the Harlequin Crest, which has the special of 20% damage reduction and all skills gain +4 ranks for some pretty massive damage increases. This also has a really big cooldown reduction roll, which is one of the ways in which we're able to have Cataclysm up 100% of the time. You also get a big armor roll, so you don't have to worry about getting your armor cap. And then we also added Tyrael's Might, and the primary reason for this is because this caps out our resistances on one item. It also increases our max resistances and gives us some pretty massive damage reduction. So we're just super tanky. We have over 80% resistances on everything, but because this gives us capped resistances at all times, we can remove resistance increases from other parts of our build to increase our power even more. And with this final version of the build, we have added another unique, Fists of Fate. And this got a pretty big rework this season in terms of its affixes. One of the biggest pieces is that it got a massive lucky hit chance roll on it. Mine is currently sitting at a little over 106% lucky hit. And what this is going to do is proc a bunch of effects, but most importantly being the effect that resets our poison creepers. So as you'll see in the footage, we just get to machine gun poison creepers, which is going to be a pretty massive part of our damage. So that brings us to our skill tree, starting with our basic, which is going to be Storm Strike. We're going to be using this a lot. Also gives us some damage reduction. Upgrade 1 can immobilize enemies. We've also taken upgrade 2 out because we really don't need the vulnerable because Cataclysm makes all enemies that hits vulnerable. Then we're going down 5 points into Landslide. This is going to be our main damaging ability, but we don't put it on our bar. The damage of our Landslide is so scaled off of the skill itself. And upgrade 1, it can now immobilize enemies. Upgrade 2, anytime you immobilize or stun an enemy or hit a boss, you spawn a Terror Mote that makes your next landslide be a guaranteed crit and deal increased critical strike damage. And the proc on this is just a 10% against bosses, which is actually really strong, especially with Cataclysm, because now the Cataclysm tracks and hits really fast. It's just machine gunning on a boss, and every time it hits that boss, it has a chance to give us a stack of Terror Motes. And since we're spawning so many landslides at once, it'll constantly be consuming as many Terror Motes as we can possibly obtain. Then we're going down. We're taking Earthen Bulwark, which is just a big barrier, got massively buffed. It scales off of your max life instead of your base life now, so it's actually a really big part of our survivability, and upgrade 1 makes us unstoppable. Then we're going down 1 point into Poison Creeper. This is primarily going to be a way that we proc other landslides. Upgrade 1 increases the duration. Upgrade 2 gives us increased critical strike chance against enemies hit by it. Then we're going down, we're taking Hurricane. This is primarily to proc other effects, but it actually does some decent damage just at a base now. And upgrade 1 slows enemies. Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage. Then we're going down 1 point into Trample. This makes us unstoppable, but the primary reason we take it is because it spawns more landslides. Then finally, we're going down, we're taking Cataclysm. This is primarily going to be for proccing other effects and just giving us massive damage increases. Upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2 makes enemies vulnerable after being hit, which is the main way we also apply vulnerable now. And that brings us to our passives. Heart of the Wild to get Wild Impulses, which is an increase to our core skills. Predatory Instinct to get 3 into Iron Fur, which is damage reduction while in werebear 3 seconds after. Every time we trample, we get this damage reduction. Then 1 into Ancestral Fortitude to get 3 into Vigilance. When we use a defensive, we gain pretty massive damage reduction, and we're constantly resetting Earthen Bulwark, so it's going to be up quite a lot. Then we're going down into Elemental Exposure, and one of the smaller changes is we took all but one of our points out of Endless Tempest, and these points have been put into Bad Omen, which is a lucky hit, up to a 30% chance when dealing damage to a vulnerable immobilize your stun target to hit it with a lightning bolt. Now we don't care about this damage. This is primarily just to proc one of our effects in our Paragon Boards, which is going to give us a massive damage increase. And then we have 2 points into Crushing Earth. Earth skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. We have 1 more point in this just to use an additional point because we really don't have any other passives that'll actually give us damage increases. 3 into Stone Guard while you have Fortify for over 50% of your max life. Earth skills skills deal more damage, then 1 into Safeguard. Crits with Earth skills fortify you for 3% of your max life. This is pretty much the entirety of our Fortify, and this will keep us fortified at all times. 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You deal increased critical strike damage against poison enemies. And I also got incredibly lucky, and I actually got a reroll into Envenom on my necklace. So this is going to be another area to massively increase your damage, is getting an Envenom roll on your necklace. It's rare, but it's very much worth getting because the damage increase is just absurd. Then 3 into Defiance. Nature skills deal increased damage to elites. 3 into Natural Disaster. Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Storm skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. Then 3 into Resonance. Nature skills deal increased damage. Triple this if an Earth skill is the next cast after a Storm skill, and vice versa. And we'll constantly be cycling through our abilities, so this will happen quite a lot. And then finally for our capstone, Nature's Fury. Casting an Earth skill has a 35% chance to trigger a free Storm skill of the same category, and vice versa. So use a Storm skill, can cast an Earth skill. And when you cast those skills, it counts as both. And also with Cataclysm, since this is an Storm skill, anytime we use this, we have a 35% chance to also cast a Petrify, which will be pretty big damage, and an AoE stun. And this will actually happen a lot because we can use Cataclysm so much. And that brings us to our Spirit Boon, starting with Wariness to take reduced damage from elites, Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. We're using Iron Feather for a pretty massive increased max life. We don't need Calamity anymore, so we move that to Iron Feather. Pack Leader, a lucky hit. Critical strikes have up to a 25% chance to reset the cooldown of your companion skills. This is a big reason why we're using our new unique, and this is going to be one of the biggest components to us dealing damage. Then Calm Before the Storm, a lucky hit. Nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. This, mixed with our cooldown of Cataclysm, it'll be up basically 100% of the time. So that brings us to our Paragon boards, and like always, we're primarily going over the glyph and board selection, but if you want to follow point by point, there'll be a build planner in the description. And if you have the Mythics Reason in this build, you don't have to worry about getting resistances or armor anywhere in your Paragon boards. You can primarily focus on getting anything that increases your damage or your survivability, more specifically your health. Now on our starter board, we're using the Electrocution glyph. We added this in the last version of the build because of our lucky hit passive that can proc lightning bolts. And the main reason we're using this is because enemies damaged by your lightning bolts take 20% increased damage for 5 seconds. 20% multiplicative damage is pretty massive. Board 1, we're using Heightened Malice. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned near you, you deal massively increased damage. The glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, a bonus to magic nodes within range. And then nature skills deal increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. So some damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, and some increased stats. Then we're going over to the right. We're taking the Constricting Tendrils board. We're taking the Outmatch glyph, which is a buff to all rare nodes within range, and you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. And this gives us massively increased max life, some nature magic damage, some more stats. Then we're going back over, we're going up, and we're taking the Inner Beast board. The glyph we're taking is Tectonic, increased earth critical strike damage, and massively increased lucky hit chance, again, to proc our lucky hits even more, giving us massively increased damage. And then we're going over to the left, we're taking Earthern Devastation. Your earth skills deal increased critical strike damage, increased by your damage versus crowd controlled up to 60%. I'm only at 59%. This will go up to 60 once I upgrade my gear. That's also one of the things you want to try to do when going through your stats, and more specifically your tempering. Because we lost our gloves with one of the tempers, now we have a less damage to crowd controlled on our piece of gear, so you want to make sure you have enough of that stat. Then the glyph we're taking is Spirit, increased critical strike damage, and critical strikes increase the damage enemies take from you by 2 up to 12%, so just more big damage increases. Then finally, we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board. The glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another bonus to magic nodes within range, and while in Werebear or Werewolf form, close enemies take increased damage from you. This will give us some increased core skill damage and some increased stats. And for our Paragon boards, I've been looking to try to see if there's more ways I can optimize specifically our damage, because we're already super tanky and we don't need to hit any defensive caps anymore, but there's not really big ways to increase our damage anymore. The biggest ones are optimizing your glyphs, because a lot of them will have that percentage damage increases in various ways, and we don't really have any more to use. So these are pretty much fully optimized Paragon boards. And finally, that brings us to our gear. And for your gems and your weapons, you want critical strike damage. In your gear, you want max life. And in your jewelry, you just want skull gems. You may not even need those to hit your armor cap. I'm pretty heavily over armor cap. That's just coming from upgrading your Harlequin crest, because it has such a big armor roll. But if you need more armor, just use gems in your jewelry, because again, we're using Tyrael's Might. That completely caps out your resistances just on that one item. And as we went over, we're using Mjolnir Ring, we're using Fist of Fate, we're using Tyrion's Might, we're using Harlequin Crest. You don't do anything to these except upgrade them. But then for our legendary aspects on your necklace, we're using when the Nature's Fury key passive triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite type are reduced by up to 7.5 seconds. So when our capstone passive procs, it reduces the cooldowns of the opposite type. So we use a Storm Strike, it casts a free Earth skill, and our cooldowns are reduced. And that's going to be resetting a majority of our abilities. And then we have our Spirit Boon to reset our Poison Creeper. All of our abilities are going to be constantly being reset, including our Cataclysm now. And then for our offensive aspects, we have less now, but you can put them wherever you want. So on your ring or your 2 weapons. So we start out with Poison Creepers active, also cast a landslide in a circle around you, and Earth skills deal increased damage to poison enemies. Then we have Trample now summons 6 landslide pillars of earth during its duration, dealing up to 100% normal damage. Trample is now a nature skill and Earth skill for more scaling. And then finally, landslides earth pillars each strike a second time and deal increased damage. So now when we use a Poison Creeper or a Trample, it spawns a big waves of landslides. Those landslides will now proc twice. And then for our other aspects on our legs, we have basic skills that grant damage reduction for up to 7 seconds. We're going to be using Storm Strike all the time, so that's just more damage reduction. And then on our boots, when you have Fortify, your Earth skills gain +2 ranks. This is not only going to be giving us pretty big damage increases for our landside, which is the majority of our damage, but this will increase the barrier of our Earthen Bulwark, which is a pretty big aspect of our defensive abilities. And then finally, for some of the more important stats, as I mentioned, I was able to get an Envenom roll on my necklace. That's going to be one of the biggest ones because the damage increase is so massive. But one of the most important ones is on both of your weapons. You want a chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice. You can get on both your weapons. These obviously can be increased through masterworking, and most optimally, while masterworking, the big upgrades would go on these temperings. That would actually be one of the biggest damage increases I could get on this build now, is to reset my masterworking to do that. This is going to be a massive damage increase. You'll notice sometimes that you just spawn your landsides. Like say you do a Poison Creeper and like one of the pillars will hit an enemy, but the enemy will take like 4 or 5 damage procs. That's just because of how many times this can proc, and this is going to be a big element of our overall damage. But that's pretty much the entirety of the build. And I can't see a ton of additional ways to optimize this build anymore, besides resetting your masterwork to get the best rolls possible, and maybe getting slightly higher rolled versions of the same affixes we're already using. But outside of that, this is pretty much the high end of what you're going to be able to do with this type of Druid build. And I think Fists of Fate really brought out a lot more power out of it, because not only is this giving us a massive lucky hit chance, but it also has a lucky hit to apply a random crowd control effect, which helps on bosses a lot because you keep applying those crowd control. It stuns a boss, you can do massive damage, but also the special effect of your attacks randomly dealing up to 300% of their normal damage is actually massive. You'll actually notice this because you'll go from needing to hit like a really tanky elite a bunch of different times with a bunch of different skills to using one Poison Creeper and it just kills it because it got a high roll on this special effect. So I think Fist of Fate is a really big addition and overall is just massively increasing our damage. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment.